I gave a version of this talk at the Far West show in Portland a couple of years ago, because when they were planning the Far West show that previous year, I guess it would have been early 2005, there was a drought. You guys were having a winter drought up in the mountains where there wasn't enough snow, I guess. People were really up in arms about it. And somebody suggested my name, and so I got asked to give this talk on trees and drought. And by August, when I gave the talk, the drought was all over. But out here on this side, drought is all the time. Let's talk about what drought is first. Drought is prolonged dry weather, according to Webster's. It's a meteorological term. Drought really isn't what the tree experiences day to day necessarily. It's over an area, a lack of rainfall or snow. But it's relative. What's dry, and what is prolonged. So drought isn't really strictly defined, although a desert, which is a very droughty area, is pretty strictly defined. At least commonly defined as less than 10 inches of precip a year, meaning right here where we are is a desert, because I think you get about 8.5 here. And this would be these areas, so above these two colors, the darkest orange, which there's only a couple little places there. Here's Oregon. I guess we're, right about there maybe? And these orange areas would be desert. Less than 10 inches precip a year. Forests, on the other hand, need greater than 15 to 20 inches a year to grow and survive. That's pertinent for landscape trees because landscape trees pretty much all came from forests and haven't even been genetically modified much, or maybe not at all, by breeding to make them more drought resistant. So that means landscape trees generally need on the order of 15 to 20 inches or more a year of precip. And of course that can be made up with irrigation. And woodlands, the juniper woodlands you have around here, often need greater than about 12 a year. I'd be interested, anybody know the junipers growing around here? Is this western juniper? Like juniper is what, occidentalis, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So it must be very drought hardy. That 2005 drought, this is drought severity measured by the Palmer Drought Index, which is just kind of how dry it is compared to how dry it is normally. And in January 2005, this is how bad it was. So actually, kind of ironically, this is Oregon again. The worst, and there it is blown up, the worst places were the wettest places in general, especially the Cascades and the Coast Range were the wettest. Out here where it's normally dry, it was still dry, but it wasn't unusually dry. But it was a fairly severe drought. Extremely dry to severe would be these dark orange squares. Severely dry would be these lighter orange. So it was quite dry, but it ended. But it turns out that really, and I don't know that I would have known this, but I lived in Corvallis for a year, and we moved there the summer of 1998 in late July, and I was surprised to find that it seemed very dry and seemed like it had been dry for at least a month or two. And in fact, the week we moved in there in Corvallis, it was 110 to 115 degree highs for a week straight. So I was pretty impressed. For such what I thought of as kind of a rainforest type wet place. But it turns out that even on that side of the mountains, it's pretty dry for at least some part of the year in Oregon. And in fact, these bars are monthly average precip over a 30-year period. The orange is for Portland, the green or yellow is for Redmond, and the white is for Salt Lake City, which I think most people think of as a pretty dry place if they've been there. And actually, Salt Lake City in July and August is wetter than Portland. And of course, Redmond's dry all the time. Just a word about what might happen in your future in the Pacific Northwest based on data from the previous 80 years, from 1920 to 2000. The future likely is going to be warmer by 0.2 to 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade increase, and that's based on trajectories from the previous 80 years. These dots just show weather stations, with the bigger the dot being more warming over the past 80 years and likely then more warming in the future as well. But about 0.2 to 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade warming, which by itself makes a place a little drier, because the warmer it is, the more evaporation you get, and therefore the drier, all things being equal, yeah.
A couple of years ago, I think it was, we had a meteorologist come here and talk about the basic warming like that, and noticing that the big dots are the hotter areas. But he also said if you look at where those big dots are, they're in metropolitan areas around Blacktop.
There are some, but certainly not all.
But you don't see any in southeastern Oregon.
But you don't see any dots in southeastern Oregon. I'm suspecting this is where they have 80 years worth of weather data. So there aren't the weather stations. Then you would have urban heat island effects as well, but they don't have enough data in some of these places. On the other hand, although it's likely to get warmer in the future, it's also likely to get wetter, which could actually leave a place like Redmond drier. Why do you think that is? It's because of that but less snow. A lot of the mountainous areas in the western U.S., including Utah where I live, they're predicting wetter climate, but possibly warmer, and therefore the two together mean less snow in the winter, less snowpack in the mountains, and a place like Redmond that's, I assume, relying on water coming out of these mountains for the water you live on, you'll have less water available coming from a snowpack. Although you may have plenty in an aquifer.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that it comes out in an aquifer the same.
It just all depends, though. If it truly becomes rain and little snowpack, a lot of places, I mean, especially as this place grows in population, it could be hard to sustain a place like this. Certainly a place like Salt Lake City would be way different. Streams might dry up earlier in the summer, that type of thing. So anyway, that's speculation about the future. Let's move on to the core of this, which is supposed to be how does drought affect plants and trees in particular, and then I'll talk a little bit about what you can do about it with trees. Drought affects trees very little and other plants if you irrigate. So if you're irrigating, the tree may not know that it's not growing in China where it's from, or upstate New York, or wherever. If you're watering it adequately, drought has very little effect. But if you can't water enough or don't water enough, then here's what happens. Drought starts with the soil drying. Drought sets in, you have less precip, therefore you have the soil drying. It either dries by water uptake from plants, water moving down through the soil profile and down to deeper depths, or water evaporating from the soil surface. This then causes plant water uptake to decrease, because as the soil dries, water is held more and more tightly in the soil. It's kind of hard to envision that, but think of the water taking more suction to get out. That's what it amounts to. And it's called soil water potential, but basically the water potential goes down, the soil gets drier, it's harder for the plant to suck water out. And therefore it takes up less. That means the tissues in the plant dehydrate, get dried out, and that causes all sorts of things. Reduction in food production because stomates close, gas exchange stops, the photosynthetic machinery of the plant shuts down or slows down. That also means less food storage, and storage is important for protection and for future growth. Less shoot growth. You need water both for maintaining photosynthesis, which is necessary for growth, but also to fill up those cells with water in the expanding zones where growth is occurring and push roots out, move growing tips out. It all takes water. Membrane integrity is really important, and we'll show a picture of this in a little bit, but membranes that surround cells and parts of cells, as cells start to dry out and the water in them gets more concentrated, the membranes start getting messed up, and start to become leaky and don't function adequately. And then drought interferes with the plant's self-defense ability, especially because of the lack of photosynthesis, and ultimately affects survival of the plant. So then plants try to resist drought, more or less, depending on their genetics and what they're set up for. And there are some strategies they can do that, but they're just strategies. Drought resistance is just strategies to withstand dry weather, drought. And they're either drought escape or drought tolerance. Drought escape is avoiding living during stressful times other than as a seed, and there aren't any woody plants that do this. And then drought tolerance is putting up with drought, and it's really common in woody plants. We won't talk anymore about drought escape mechanisms other than just this slide. Drought escape is kind of like James Dean kind of strategy for life. Grow and mature fast, reproduce quickly, die young. That's what drought escaping plants do. All this is done while water is abundant and the tissues then aren't really exposed to drying. And examples of these would be like cheatgrass out on rangelands, some cereal crops like winter wheat in particular that do all their growing during the winter when there's plenty of water available and then mature before it gets hot and dry in the summer and set seed. And then certain desert ephemerals, when they talk about the desert blooming after a rainfall, those are plants that take advantage of the wetness but then mature and set seed before it gets dry. So anyway, that has nothing to do with woodies. Woody plants all get by drought with drought tolerance. They have to put up with either drying out, having their tissues dry out, which is called or put off drying out, which is called dehydration postponement, or tolerate drying out, which is dehydration tolerance. So they either try to take up more water, move more water through themselves somehow, or if they can't do that long enough, eventually their tissues are going to start drying out, and there are mechanisms they can use to help them withstand that. So we'll talk about dehydration postponement and then dehydration tolerance. Dehydration postponement is keeping your tissues moist by maintaining water uptake even as the soil is drying out because it's droughty. And also decreasing water loss to keep as wet as possible and use the water you've got. And it's really common in woody plants. Dehydration tolerance is when the soil continues to dry out, you can't maintain your water uptake adequately to replace the water loss, the tissues being able to stand that. We'll talk about some mechanisms for each of these. Dehydration postponement, you can maintain water uptake by having bigger root systems, either deeper or wider or more extensive within the area they're growing in, and also by maintaining a vascular system in the roots and the trunk and the branches that can move a lot of water even when there's a lot of drying going on. And then you reduce water loss in a number of ways, and we'll look at each of these. So, maintaining water uptake by increased rooting. Trees can grow their root systems wide to try to access a lot of water, maybe compete with their neighbors for water. But it's also important that trees grow their root systems deep in droughty areas. And you can affect that, of course, by how you irrigate landscapes and encourage deep rooting by making sure you deep irrigate occasionally so some roots can grow deep. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But you need both wide and deep root systems. Desert plants, turns out, often have extremely extensive root systems, sometimes with roots. Desert shrubs can have roots 60 feet deep, all to get roots down beyond where other plants have roots to be able to compete for what little water is available. And then I mentioned here explore and re-explore. Sometimes people get clear in their minds the idea of tree root systems going out laterally. And I think people tend to think, maybe because of the drawings of root systems you see, that you have woody roots that become smaller and smaller and smaller and then fine roots way out at the tips. But you've got all this soil volume in closer to the tree, that the root system has grown through already, that constantly has to be re-explored. Only those fine growing tips of the roots are very successful at taking up water. The big woody roots have bark on them and don't take up water very well. So you need to have fine roots out at your tip, out at the tips, out at the edges of the root system, but you also need to continually regrow roots through areas you've already grown a root system through. And it turns out most fine roots of trees only grow for a matter of weeks, and then they stop growing and they die and they're replaced by new roots, just for that purpose, to constantly regrow a root system, to have it to get water that maybe a root grew through an area, took up the water and minerals that were available, used up all the water, more water came through from a rainfall event, now more root growth has to occur for that water to be used and those minerals to be taken up. Yeah.
So you're saying that there's not a lot of those fibrous water-absorbing roots near the trunk?
No, relatively speaking, in terms of amount per soil volume, there should be just as many.
Okay.
Other than you have a lot of woody roots getting in the way, but yeah, there should be a lot. What I think sometimes people think is you mainly have them out near the edges, and that's not the case. They're all over the place. I did my master's research on black walnut root growth with rhizotrons, where we went into the woods and dug pits in the ground 2 meters deep and 1 meter wide and 1 meter this way with plexiglass spaces, and these were only 1.5 foot out from the trees, the trunks of the trees, and I had all sorts of roots growing all over, mostly within the top 2 feet, but I had lots of roots, and yet I was very close into the tree. Maintaining water uptake, so that was maintaining water uptake by having an extensive root system, but then you have to have that root system connected to an efficient way to transport water through the xylem, the wood of the tree, the wood in the roots, the wood in the trunk, and the branches. And this is just one example of an efficient way to move a lot of water when there's a lot of water available, and then to be conservative later on in a year when there's less water available. This is called ring porous anatomy, and it's common in oaks. It's what gives oak wood its nice grain. And imagine this is a cross-section looking down on the trunk, and imagine the bark being there at the end of the year, the cambium being right there and the bark out here. And then it starts growing, and in the early wood, the wood formed in the spring or early summer, you get really big tubes. These are tubes just that have been cut open. And these really big tubes can move a lot of water, but they're moving there to move a lot of water when there's a lot of water available, which is in the spring. Most trees grow in temperate climates, at least, grow in places where spring is when it's wet, maybe due to snow melt and rain, and then summers dry out. A big tube is a great way to move a lot of water. 1 square foot cross-sectional area of a big pipe moves a lot more water than that same cross-sectional area in a bunch of little pipes because there's resistance. But it's risky when the soil starts drying out later in the season, because you remember I said it takes a lot of suction to get water out of a drying soil. Well, a lot of suction put on a big tube causes air bubbles to form. They're called embolisms, or the event is called a cavitation. It's thought to be possible that some insects actually hear air bubbles forming in stressed trees' xylem and go for those trees and preferentially attack them, which isn't my subject, but this is risky anatomy for a dry climate, but it's good anatomy for a wet spring, wet early summer climate. So move a lot of water when it's available, but then later on in the growing season form tubes. These are some moderate-sized xylem vessels, but there's even some smaller ones you can't really see here. Smaller vessels move much less water per cross-sectional area but they're less risky because they don't form those bubbles as much. So it's a good kind of a adaptation to a climate that's alternating wet and dry in this particular case. Some xylem has nothing but small vessels, like pines and spruces and such. Have nothing but very small tracheids, they're called, very small tubes. And then some plants don't put any special effort into the kind of xylem. They just grow a lot of it, like poplars and cottonwoods and willows, because they rely on ready availability of water all the time whenever they need it. Okay, so that was getting as much water in as possible. Now we need to talk about reducing water loss. And mainly you do this by reducing the water loss through your skin, your outer tissues, especially on leaves. And there's a lot of ways plants do this. Most of these pictures are electron micrographs from electron microscopes. And this would be a cell, this would be a cell. These striations, these lines are actually wax on the surface of the cells and pectin. And these are stomates with paired cells that open and close more or less efficiently to let carbon dioxide in and unavoidably let some water vapor out, because the inside of the leaf is moist and humid, and that humidity leaves the leaf when the stomate opens. Some trees are very good at controlling their stomates and closing them really tight to keep from losing water. Some trees are very poor at that. Black walnut, for example, is very poor at closing its stomate, but it has other ways it deals with reducing water loss in drought. Sometimes stomates are sunken deep in the leaf, so they're in a little humid chamber that reduces water loss while they can still maintain CO2 uptake. Here's another form of wax on another kind of tree leaf. I'm not sure what kind of tree this is, but there's wax coating the surface, and then there are these wax tubes. I thought it just looked cool. It turns out at the bottom of every one of these tubes is a stomate. And that tube then becomes a little more humid than the surrounding atmosphere around that leaf, and therefore the leaf loses a little less water when it opens its stomate to take in carbon dioxide. And there's lots of forms of wax. There are also all sorts of scales. If anybody can identify this species, I don't have anything to give you. I'll shake your hand. Anybody know what that is? It's a species really noted for all of its surfaces being covered with scales, and they rub off on your hand. And it's probably a weedy species up here. Russian olive. Russian olive, you ever wipe on a leaf of a Russian olive and stuff comes off on your fingers? That's what comes off on your fingers. They're called peltate or shield-shaped scales, and they actually look like a parasol. There's a stalk attached right there that goes down to the surface of the leaf, and there's multiple layers of these. There's one underneath. It's just multiple layers stacked up, and the stomates are buried way down under all that, and this is all to reduce water loss. But still be able to open your stomates and take in some carbon dioxide. And then hairs serve the same function. This is one of the most drought-tolerant cottonwood or poplar species that exists. Anybody take a guess? Asian native. Populus alba, the white poplar. You must have that on old farmsteads or something around here. With the white, dense white hair underneath. That's what this hair looks like. And stomates are way down underneath there. By the way, another stomatal trick is to put all your stomates on the bottom of the leaf and not have any on top, because the underneath side of the leaf is the most humid place. Cottonwoods and willows put their stomates on both sides of the leaves, at least most of them do, because again, they don't care so much about being efficient with water. They want to take in a lot of carbon dioxide and grow fast. But oaks, ashes, and such put them only on the underside. You can also reduce water loss besides covering your surface to make things more humid and reduce water loss that way, you can also shade the surface to reduce the amount of sun hitting. And hairs and scales are one way to do that. There's the Russian olive again. But also changing your leaf orientation. There aren't a lot of woody plants that do this. Some desert species do it, like acacia. Their leaflets will fold up during the hottest, driest part of the day to have less sun hit them so that they evaporate less water. And then wax, again, is another way to shade the leaf. Very thick wax layers. You can also reduce your evaporative surface area. I mentioned black walnut has a different way it deals with water loss. This is a black walnut with in fall color in Logan, Utah, but I'll tell you, where black walnut is native in the Midwest, it hardly ever has leaves on it come September. I didn't know it had nice fall color, partly because the leaves get a leaf spot disease in Missouri, where I did my research, but also Missouri has really deep, dry summer droughts where it won't rain for a couple of months, often. And the way black walnut deals with that is it can't close its stomates very well. It's just not very good at that, or it loses too much water through the epidermis of the leaf, just the surface. So it starts losing leaflets from its compound leaves. And the drier it gets, the more leaflets it loses, and then it doesn't have any surface area to lose water from. Mesquite and Palo Verde desert species do this as well. And then having fewer and smaller and thicker leaves is another way to reduce evaporative surface area, especially at certain times of year. This is actually a barberry, a Fremont barberry, a desert species that's being promoted now in Utah as a native barberry. Really cool species. You wouldn't think that was related to like Mahonia, Oregon grape, would you? But it's very closely related. And that's Palo Verde. Conifers also have leaves like that many times. Then you can lobe your leaves and cut them up and serrate them, have teeth, dissect them into compound instead of simple. Those are all ways to maintain carbon dioxide but to cool the leaf off. It turns out in droughty environments it can be very important to keep your leaf cool, because in moderate environments it's not so much important that evaporation from the leaf cools the leaf. But keeping the leaf cool in a really droughty environment that's hot can be very important because you lose more water if you're hot. Leaves do it just like us. And so in general, there's lots of exceptions to this, but an entire leaf with no teeth is less drought hardy, all things being equal, than a finely toothed leaf, which is less drought hardy than a coarsely toothed leaf or a very coarsely toothed leaf. Those teeth help shed heat and reduce water loss. Banana is a tree that grows in a very moist environment in the tropics. Even banana leaves come out entire and whole without any tatters in them, and that's when there's plenty of water available. And as it gets hotter and drier, the leaf will tear along the veins and start to flutter, and that's to increase heat loss, reduce heat loading. Lobes are the same kind of thing. There's plenty of exceptions, but lobed leaves tend to be more drought hardy than less lobed leaves. And then more and more finely dissected leaves are more drought hardy than less finely dissected. So compound leaves like that Palo Verde we saw a while back with the really fine leaflets, that's a very drought hardy design if you do the other things right, like close your stomates right. So that was all to postpone getting dry by trying to take more water up and keep from losing water. But let's say the drought deepens and the soil gets even drier. It's harder to take water up. Eventually you're going to have to tolerate drought. And there's lots of biochemical ways trees do this kind of thing, trees and other plants. You can either try not to wilt, because wilting is a very disruptive thing to the machinery of the leaf, and wilting is a bad sign for sure. And then also maintain some suction to take up what little water there is still available in that drying soil. And then finally just take it, just put up with it. Have tissues that can deal with it. These are the very drought-tolerant plants. So don't wilt. This is the hardest part of what I'm going to present in this topic today, but we've got a graphic coming up that should help with this. I mentioned that it takes suction to get water out of soil. And the drier the soil is, the more suction it takes. The plant, the suction ultimately comes from the atmosphere, sucking on the leaves, sucking water out of the leaves. That's the driving force to eventually suck water out of the ground. Well, the plant can actually increase its ability to suck water out of a drying soil by doing what's called osmotic adjustment. It actually accumulates sugars and amino acids and other things in its tissues and lowers its water potential, which means it creates more suction. It takes days to weeks to do this, but it can do it. And this is kind of how the process works. Water moves from areas of high potential energy to low potential energy. Rocks move from areas of high potential energy to low potential energy. You put a rock on top of a cliff, it's got high potential energy. You kick it off, when it gets to the bottom, it's got low energy. Water's the same way. It moves from areas of high potential energy to low. What's confusing about this is the units they measure soil or water potential energy in are negative. So negative 0.1 megapascals. That would be a drying soil, but still one with a fair amount of moisture in it, would have negative 0.1 megapascals water potential. Okay, remember, for water to move from the soil into the root, the water potential in the root has to be lower than that, lower than negative 0.1. So the root might have a water potential of negative 1.1. That's enough for water to move into the root from the soil. And that blue arrow shows water moving in. Then the xylem up higher in the plant, this is xylem in the root too, of course, the xylem higher in the plant has to be even lower or the water would stay in the root. It wouldn't go anywhere. So this is the suction that's happening to draw that water up the stem and eventually out to the branches and out into the xylem and the leaves. And then ultimately the air has a much lower water potential, maybe on the order of negative 100 megapascal. Air is always plenty dry to be able to draw water out of plants. Even fairly humid air is still very dry compared to the inside of the plant. And so the water then evaporates from the leaf interior, moves out through the stomates, and there's water molecules floating around in the air. Okay, so this is what happens. Water moving along this water potential gradient from high to low, or less negative to more negative, and moving out into the air. That's how water is sucked through the plant, sucked out of a dry soil. Well, as that soil gets even drier, the tissue water potential has to decrease even further for water uptake to occur. So now instead of 0.1 megapascals, we've got soil water potential of negative 1, a pretty dry soil, which means the root has to be even lower than it was, and the xylem lower, and again the air doesn't change, and you get water movement out of an even drier soil. And the way that water potential change in the xylem occurs and in the root is osmotic adjustment up in those upper tissues. Okay, so that's called osmotic adjustment. So that's maintaining water uptake through biochemical means through osmotic adjustment. It takes some energy and some time, but really drought-tolerant plants can do it. It turns out that also makes those tissues more frost-tolerant. But as plants dehydrate, eventually they may need to just take it and put up with it if they're going to be drought-tolerant. But they have to keep their cell machinery going or they die, or at least they shut down. They also need to protect their membranes from leaking. And here's what a membrane might look like in a cell. It's a couple of layers of fatty molecules. The outer part, the red part, likes water, and the blue part only likes other blue parts. So you get this double layer of fatty material with proteins embedded in it, and that's a typical cell membrane. It keeps good stuff in the cell and keeps bad stuff out of the cell. And it's kind of fluid and moves around a lot, and the proteins that move around a lot, and it might look kind of like that, with the outside of the cell up here, the inside down there, and surrounded by water. Well, as the water in the cell and outside the cell gets more and more concentrated as things dry out, that cell membrane structure starts to break down. One of the main ways we end up getting tissue damage and things like leaf scourge is because cells die because membranes leak. And they actually can get these channels, they get really stiff, and then they can get these channels forming that let stuff right through. If you think about it, if you didn't have a skin and stuff keeping you all in, you wouldn't be any different. You'd be a pile of stuff out on the pavement, you know. And trees are the same way. Plants are the same way. Their cells have to have those membranes to keep their innards intact. So finally, what can you do? That's how trees react to drought, how plants react to drought, but what can you do? And I'll go over each of these, but select more drought-tolerant plants, zone landscapes to irrigate appropriately, avoid sudden stress because osmotic adjustment takes time and other changes take time, know the symptoms of water stress, and then maintain good extensive root systems. There's more you could do, but this was kind of the top 5 or 6. First, a couple of terms. If you ever hear of a hydrophyte or a hydrophytic plant or a hydric plant, it means a plant that needs to be right near water all the time. Mosses, duckweeds, things like that. Mesophytes or mesic plants are moderate in drought tolerance, and for trees we might think of like lindens or some of the maples that aren't so drought tolerant. And then xeric plants or xerophytic plants are those that have high drought tolerance because of some of these mechanisms we talked about. They're like junipers, some of the oaks, most of the pines, so on. And in selection, what we need to try to do in areas where drought is becoming more of an issue, or maybe irrigation availability is becoming an issue, is to move from having a lot of mesophytes in the landscape to more xeric plants, like more of the oaks, more of the junipers, so on. And a good way to find, especially if you're willing to do a little research and dig in the literature a little bit, read some books, read some magazine articles, is to find plants from places where drought is common. Because if you find a plant that's native to an area with 20 inches of 15 inches of precip, even though it's being grown in a nursery in the Willamette Valley, it's adapted to a place that that has 15 inches of precip a year. It doesn't lose that adaptation just because it's grown in a nursery over in a wet area. And the reason for that is because most woody plants are just selected from native stuff. They're not really bred to be drought tolerant. Places to look, and we'll kind of go out radiating out from nearby, are plants that are native to drier parts of the Columbia Basin, the Pacific Northwest interior, plants like natives around here. Maybe on the edges of the mountains at the lowest elevations where you'd have the warmest, driest locations. Spreading out a little, the Great Basin in general, low elevation, south and west slopes, those are going to be places where there's drought-tolerant species. The Great Plains. It turns out a lot of the species that come out onto the edge of the Great Plains, out as far west as about the 100th meridian, kind of central to western Nebraska and South Dakota, Kansas. A lot of those plants tend to be good for droughty places to have some, in terms of having non-natives in your landscapes, because they're adapted to drought and they're also adapted to high soil pH, which often goes along with drought. And then in the southwestern U.S. and Mexico, there's species that are appropriate. Then some Mediterranean species, if cold isn't too much of a problem. And then finally, a lot of really good landscape species that are pretty available in the landscape trade that are drought hardy tend to come from parts of Asia that are droughty. Besides selection, landscaping, where you zone your landscape to be able to irrigate properly with the right amount of water so you can have wetter areas but also drier areas, are really important. In xeriscaping, the move to xeriscaping in Utah, we've got a lot of people that are ending up killing their trees because they're not zoning their landscapes, they're not watering appropriately for each part of the landscape, and they're putting a xeriscape in around a little leaf linden, and that just doesn't work. But you can have a little leaf linden if you really want one, if you put the right landscape in around it and still have your xeriscape in another part of the landscape. Avoiding sudden stress can be important. It doesn't come up a lot, but you want to wean a landscape off of water. And trees can be, some tree species can be trained to be a little more drought hardy. If it's not in their genetics, you'll never do it. You'll never make a little leaf linden drought hardy. But reducing irrigation gradually, occasionally deep watering, can help extend root systems so the plant is more able to take up water from bigger volumes of soil. And with plants that are new from nurseries especially, they may not initially be drought hardy. They've been well watered, and you may need to ramp down the water over a period of time to let them adjust. It takes time. You probably all know the symptoms of water stress, but scorch like this is real classic, and you even get a version of scorch on conifers. You'll have the ends of the needles start to brown. But it's just the plant trying to lose tissue to lose less water. And similarly, leaf drop is just going further and losing more tissue to reduce water loss. Slow growth also. And then do the things you need to do to maintain good extensive root systems. And that's mainly reducing compaction and watering adequately, but also avoiding things like trenches, even shallow trenches near the tree, since most roots are in the top 12 inches or so, can be a problem. Organic mulches where appropriate, and then fertilization doesn't matter so much for good root systems, but water matters and oxygen matter the most. So there's my contact information. And question? I have a few minutes. Yeah, go ahead, July. Yeah.
I have a question about those products that are called like Wilt proof, things like that. In particular, we have sometimes a challenge with plants drying out through the winter months here. If we don't have a lot of snowfall, we can have plants, especially new ones not established, and they'll dry out through the winter months. So
evergreen.
Yeah, some of the broadleaf evergreen that people will try. So the Wilt, what's your experience with that? I've heard mixed reviews about whether or not it works. Or
I don't have a lot of experience with it. They're anti-transference. They're fatty, oily material to coat surfaces to prevent both epidermal evaporation and then also they'll prevent some stomatal evaporation, which, one advantage evergreens have is they can photosynthesize when times are good, even in the winter, as long as they have some water uptake occurring and it's a sunny day and the tissue warms up enough. And of course, if you coat them with fatty stuff, they're not going to photosynthesize as well. I doubt if it's much of a problem. It seems to me if you had a lot of that, I tend to think any kind of intervention you have to do other than irrigation, that you have to do a lot, means you probably have the wrong plant or you're not managing it right. So maybe it's the wrong plant, maybe it's not in the right place in the landscape, maybe it's shade tolerant species that should be in a more shady spot. I just hate to think of people applying stuff like that year in, year out forever to keep some plant going that shouldn't be there. Are rhododendrons and azaleas grown much over here? Mm-hmm. I'll bet people would love to have
H1 hybrids.
And those are better. But I imagine you get some of those problems you're talking about with those plants. And so the place for those plants in the landscape here might be on the north side of a building where they're not going to get sun in the summer or in the winter. Turns out a lot of people tend to think if a plant has problems with the cold, putting it on the warm side of the building is best, and often putting it on the cold side of the building where it gets no direct sun is best because it won't heat up too much. And you probably heard that before.
I was glad to hear you mention about the xeriscaping, everybody into water conservation and drip systems, and not, taking the trees that they have, especially in mature landscaping. They'll suddenly change the irrigation system in there and want to update it so it conserves water, but there's nothing left over for the mature tree that has its roots growing out the whole landscape.
Yeah, I think people tend to think trees are
indestructible.
Yeah, indestructible, or they just don't understand that. They kind of know plants need water. They know if they don't water their grass, it turns brown. Maybe the symptoms on trees are a little less noticeable and obvious, so they just don't quite understand, I think. And then sometimes the xeriscaping messages are too simple and don't include. We've got a program the Utah Rivers Council's doing to try to keep more water in native rivers. They're doing a Rip Your Strip program, which is a good idea, and it's rip up your parking strip, just one part of your lawn, in other words, take out the grass and put in low water use plants. And I think it's a good idea. But the people who designed it weren't plant people, they were river people, and they didn't realize that they were also promoting, if you have big trees, great, don't rip them up, but they didn't realize that the water requirements of the trees were likely going to be quite a bit different. Eventually, over time, we would go to where you'd start to have different, even tree species that were more drought tolerant. They're still not going to be as drought tolerant as most low elevation Utah native plants, and the same here. Even a ponderosa pine planted here isn't going to be drought tolerant enough to grow in a true xeriscape here at 8.5 inches of precip. But it would be better than a linden. I'm really ragging on linden.
It just kind of bothers me too. Everybody's talking about global warming and the wasting of water. I mean, the more trees and plants we grow on Earth, the less global warming we're having.
Yeah,
lawns, anything green, anything with water that's producing photosynthesis.
Well, the only way you help with global warming is if you either burn less fossil fuels by using less electricity or something. And certainly trees can have a role in that by shading a house to cool it, that type of thing. But for like carbon, taking up CO2, the only way it matters is if you have body that is going to be around a long time. In other words, like the trunk of a tree. Grass, not so much, because you can take up CO2 with grass, but it's released almost as quickly as it's being taken up because of respiration. But that's not my topic. So.